When a disabled Marine and his service dog were denied boarding, Donald Trump's response left an entire airport terminal in tears. The early morning silence at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport shattered as a Marine veteran's voice cracked with emotion. "This dog isn't just an animal. He's the reason I'm alive." Michael Anderson stood at gate C-23, his weathered hands trembling as he gripped Max's service vest. The German Shepherd pressed closer to his owner's leg, sensing the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm him. No one expected what would happen next, or how one man's intervention would transform a moment of injustice into a movement that would sweep across the nation. Minutes earlier, Michael had approached the gate with the quiet dignity that came from years of military service. His leather jacket bore the scars of time, and the Semper Fi cap sat low over eyes that had seen too much. Max, his service dog of 3 years, walked perfectly in step beside him. The pair had flown dozens of times before. Max's documentation was always in order, his training impeccable. But today was different. "I'm sorry, sir," the gate agent said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's been a change in policy. We can't accept service animals on this flight, even with documentation." The words hit Michael like shrapnel. His breath caught in his throat as memories of darker days flooded back, nights when the demons of war wouldn't let him sleep, mornings when leaving his house felt like walking into enemy territory. The service dog at his side wasn't just a companion. He was Michael's anchor to reality, the reason he could face the world again. "That can't be right," Michael managed, his military training barely containing his rising panic. "Federal law protects service animals. I have all the required paperwork right here." His fingers, once steady enough to disarm explosives in Fallujah, now trembled as he tried to organize his documents. Passengers began to slow their hurried pace, drawn into the unfolding drama. A mother pulled her curious child closer, whispering questions about the man in the military cap and his dignified dog. An elderly gentleman, himself a veteran judging by his Vietnam War cap, stopped completely, his face darkening with recognition of a fellow soldier's distress. The gate agent tapped nervously at her tablet, avoiding Michael's gaze. "I understand, sir, but the new policy is very clear. Perhaps we could rebook you on another carrier." Max sensed his owner's distress, pressing his body firmly against Michael's leg, a grounding technique they'd practiced countless times during flashbacks and panic attacks. But this time, it wasn't enough. The walls of the terminal seemed to close in as Michael fought against the crushing weight of anxiety and humiliation. What happened next would not only change Michael's life, but would spark a nationwide conversation about how America treats its veterans. And it all began when a familiar voice cut through the tension, a voice accustomed to commanding rooms much larger than this terminal. Donald Trump had been quietly observing the scene, and what he was about to do would leave everyone in tears. The terminal fell silent as Donald Trump stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without effort. He wore a simple navy suit, having just arrived from a business meeting, but it was his expression, one of controlled anger and determination, that drew all eyes to him. Unlike his usual public appearances, there was something different in his demeanor now, a quiet intensity that spoke of personal conviction rather than political performance. "Excuse me," Trump said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What seems to be the problem here?" Though his tone remained measured, there was an edge to it that made the gate agent straighten instinctively. The years of commanding boardrooms and rallies had taught him exactly how to make his presence felt. The supervisor, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward with the rehearsed confidence of someone used to enforcing rules. "Sir, this is a private matter between the airline and—" "Private?" Trump interrupted, his voice rising just enough to carry across the terminal. "There's nothing private about denying a Marine veteran his rights." He turned to Michael, his demeanor softening noticeably. "How long did you serve, son?" "3 tours in Iraq, sir," Michael replied, his hand still resting on Max's head. "Made it home in one piece, but—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Some scars you can't see." Max leaned harder against his leg, sensing the tremor in his voice. Trump nodded, understanding flickering across his face. A shadow passed over his features, reminiscent of countless conversations he'd had with veterans at rallies and events. "You know," he said, more to the gathering crowd than to anyone in particular, "I've met thousands of veterans over the years. Each one carries something back with them, something most of us will never understand." The crowd that had gathered grew larger, phones appearing in hands as people sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. A young woman in scrubs wiped tears from her eyes. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap nodded slowly, his own eyes glistening with recognition. Trump turned back to the airline staff, his jaw set with purpose. "My father taught me something years ago," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He said that when you see someone who's fought for this country being wronged, you don't just stand there and watch, you act." Fred Trump wasn't just talking about business, he was talking about character. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Trump and the growing audience. The mention of Fred Trump seemed to hang in the air, a reminder of values that transcended corporate policies. "Mr. Trump, with all due respect, airline policy—" "Policy?" Trump's voice carried a sharp edge now. "Let me tell you about policy. I've sat in rooms with CEOs and politicians who hide behind policies when they don't want to do what's right. But here's what they forget. Policies are meant to serve people, not hurt them. And right now, your policy isn't just hurting this Marine. It's sending a message to every veteran watching this." He stepped closer to Michael and Max, placing a hand on the veteran's shoulder. "This man didn't just serve our country. He came back carrying burdens most of us can't imagine. And that dog? That's not just an animal. That's his lifeline, his hope, his way back to normal life." Michael stood straighter, Max pressing against his leg as if lending him strength. Trump's words seemed to awaken something in the terminal, a collective conscience that had been dormant until now. Passengers who had been hurrying to their gates now stood still, drawn into this moment of truth. "You know what makes America great?" Trump continued, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "It's not our policies or our procedures, it's how we treat people like Michael. People who gave everything for this country, asking nothing in return except dignity and respect." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. An older woman clutching her boarding pass spoke up, her voice quavering with emotion. "My son served too. Came back different. These service dogs, they're angels on 4 legs." Trump nodded, acknowledging her words. "Exactly. And today, we're not just fighting for Michael and Max. We're fighting for every veteran who might walk through these doors tomorrow, next week, next year." The supervisor, now visibly uncomfortable, tried one last time. "Mr. Trump, I understand your concern, but I don't have the authority to—" "Authority?" Trump reached for his phone, his expression hardening with resolve. "Let me tell you about authority. Sometimes it's not about who has it, it's about who's willing to use it for what's right." What happened next would transform this moment from a simple confrontation into something that would change airline policies forever. As Trump dialed a number, the entire terminal held its breath. The call he was about to make would leave everyone speechless, and the chain of events it would set in motion would remind America what it means to stand up for those who stood up for us. The terminal fell into an expectant hush as Trump held the phone to his ear, his free hand resting supportively on Michael's shoulder. Even Max seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, his alert eyes scanning between his owner and Trump. The ringtone echoed faintly in the silence. "Doug?" Trump's voice carried the authority of someone used to making things happen. "It's Donald. I need you to listen carefully because what I'm about to tell you is happening right now, and it needs to be fixed." He paused, his eyes never leaving the airline supervisor's increasingly pale face. "I'm standing in your terminal at DFW, watching one of your employees deny boarding to a Marine veteran and his service dog." The crowd pressed closer, straining to hear both sides of the conversation. Through the speaker, a muffled voice responded with increasing urgency. Trump's expression remained stern. "No, Doug, I don't want to hear about policies. This man served 3 tours in Iraq. His dog isn't a pet, he's a lifeline." Trump's voice rose slightly, carrying the weight of years spent in boardrooms where decisions affected thousands. "You're not just violating his rights, you're violating everything this country stands for." Michael watched in stunned silence, his hand absently stroking Max's fur. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still, as if understanding the importance of this moment. Around them, phones recorded every second, capturing what was quickly becoming more than just an airline dispute. "Listen carefully," Trump continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I want 2 things to happen in the next 5 minutes. First, Michael Anderson and Max are getting on this flight. No questions, no paperwork, no hassle. Second, I want your PR team ready for a conversation about changing these policies permanently." He listened for a moment, his jaw tightening. "No, this isn't about me making a scene. This is about doing what's right. And if you're worried about publicity, think about how this looks right now. Dozens of phones recording your staff denying a veteran his basic rights." The supervisor's phone buzzed in his pocket. His hands shaking slightly, he checked the message and his eyes widened. "Sir," he said to Trump, "we just received authorization from corporate. Mr. Anderson and his service dog are cleared for boarding." But Trump wasn't finished. He held up a hand, silencing the supervisor. "Doug, I'm not done. I want you to understand something. This isn't just about today. Every day, veterans walk through these terminals carrying burdens we can't see. They don't ask for much, just respect, dignity, and the rights they've earned." The elderly Vietnam veteran who had been watching stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell him, Mr. Trump. Tell him about the nights when the memories won't let you sleep. Tell him why these dogs are more than just animals." Trump nodded, his expression softening as he addressed the phone again. "You hear that, Doug? That's a Vietnam vet speaking. This isn't politics. This is about honoring promises. These men and women signed blank checks payable with their lives. The least we can do is make sure they can fly with the companions who help them heal." Michael's eyes glistened as he listened. Max, sensing his emotion, pressed closer, performing the grounding technique they'd practiced countless times. A young mother nearby wiped tears from her eyes, pulling her curious child closer as she whispered explanations about heroes and the dogs who helped them. "Here's what's going to happen," Trump continued, his voice carrying the certainty of someone accustomed to making deals that stuck. "By the end of today, I want a public statement from your airline. Not just an apology, a commitment. New policies that respect our veterans and their service animals. Clear guidelines that every employee understands." He paused, listening to the response. "Yes, I understand it takes time to implement changes. But right now, in this terminal, you have an opportunity to show America where you stand. Are you going to hide behind bureaucracy, or are you going to do what's right?" The terminal remained silent, hundreds of people collectively holding their breath. Even the usual airport announcement seemed muted, as if the very building was waiting for the outcome. The supervisor's phone buzzed again, and this time when he checked it, his entire demeanor changed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the supervisor announced, his voice carrying across the crowd, "I've just received word from our CEO. Effective immediately, we are reviewing and revising all our service animal policies. And, Mr. Anderson," he turned to Michael, "we would be honored to have you and Max aboard our flight today." Applause erupted throughout the terminal. Several veterans in the crowd stepped forward to shake Michael's hand. A flight attendant, wiping tears from her eyes, approached with a fresh bottle of water for Max and an upgrade ticket for first class. Trump ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. But instead of stepping away, he turned to Michael, his voice lowering to a personal tone that few got to hear. "You know, I've built buildings, made deals, been on television, but none of that matters compared to what men like you have done for this country." Michael straightened, years of military bearing taking over despite his emotion. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," Trump interrupted, his hand still on Michael's shoulder. "Thank yourself. Your service, your sacrifice, that's what made this right. I just reminded them of what they should have already known." A young girl, no more than 7, broke away from her mother and approached Michael and Max. In her small hand, she clutched a hair ribbon. "Can I give this to your dog?" she asked shyly. "My mommy says he's a hero, too." Michael knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "He is a hero," he said softly. "Would you like to know why?" The girl nodded eagerly. "Because he helps me be brave when I forget how." With gentle hands, he helped her tie the ribbon to Max's collar, the simple gesture carrying more weight than any policy or procedure. Trump watched the scene unfold, and for a moment his public persona fell away completely. This wasn't about politics or publicity. It was about humanity, about standing up for what's right even when it would be easier to walk away. But just as the moment seemed to reach its natural conclusion, something unexpected happened. Something that would turn this airport incident into a national movement. As Michael prepared to board his flight, a familiar face appeared in the crowd, and the next phase of this story would remind America what it truly means to support our veterans. Just as Michael and Max prepared to board, a distinguished figure in military dress blues emerged from the crowd. General James Wilson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had been quietly observing the entire scene unfold. His presence, unexpected and commanding, brought a new gravity to the moment. "Mr. Trump," the general called out, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military service. "A moment, if you would." The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path between these two pillars of authority. Trump turned, recognition flickering across his face. The general approached steadily, his medals catching the terminal's fluorescent light. "I was on my way to a military briefing when I witnessed what just happened here." He paused, looking between Trump and Michael. "This isn't just about one veteran and his service dog anymore. This is about a broken system that's failing our heroes every day." Trump nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're thinking what I'm thinking, aren't you, General?" "Yes, sir. It's time for more than just one airline's policy change. It's time for a complete overhaul of how this country treats its veterans." The general turned to address the crowd, his presence commanding complete attention. "What you witnessed today happens countless times across America. Veterans struggling with invisible wounds, fighting systems that should be supporting them." Michael stood straighter, Max alert at his side as the general approached them. "Son," he said softly, "your struggle today might just be the catalyst we've been waiting for." Trump stepped forward, his business instincts merging with genuine passion. "We could draft legislation," he said, his voice carrying the energy of someone who saw not just a problem, but a solution. "Clear, comprehensive protection for service animals and their veterans. No more gray areas, no more policy confusion." The terminal had grown silent again, but this time the silence carried anticipation rather than tension. Phones recorded every word, every gesture, as history seemed to unfold in real time. "Mr. President," the general said, using Trump's former title with deliberate respect, "with your platform and my position, we could make this happen within months, not years." A young veteran in the crowd spoke up, his voice trembling with emotion. "Sir, I've been denied access 3 times this year alone with my service dog. Each time, I just gave up and drove instead. We need this." Trump's expression hardened with resolve. "Then let's do it right here, right now." He pulled out his phone again, but this time he didn't make a call. Instead, he opened his social media app and began typing, speaking the words aloud as he wrote, "Today at DFW Airport, I witnessed a Marine veteran being denied boarding with his service dog. What happened next will change how America treats its heroes. General Wilson and I are launching the Service Dog Protection Act. No veteran should ever fight for rights they've already earned. # Service Dog Act. #veteran rights. Within seconds, the post started gaining traction. Phones throughout the terminal buzzed as the message spread like wildfire across social media platforms. The supervisor, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward again. "Mr. Trump, General Wilson," he said, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "Our CEO would like to be the first corporate sponsor of this initiative. He's offering to cover the costs of flying veterans and their service animals across our entire network while the legislation is being drafted." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Michael, still processing everything happening around him, felt Max press against his leg as emotions threatened to overwhelm him. A flight attendant touched his arm gently. "Sir, we need to begin boarding, but—" She hesitated, then continued with determination. "Would you be willing to say a few words to our passengers? They should hear from you directly." Michael looked uncertain, but Trump placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Tell them, son. Tell them what they need to hear." Taking a deep breath, Michael stepped forward. Max moved with him, perfectly in sync, a living example of the bond between veterans and their service animals. His voice, when it came, carried the quiet strength of someone who had faced battles both visible and invisible. "I never wanted to be part of something like this," he began, his words carrying clearly across the hushed terminal. "All I wanted was to fly home with Max, the partner who helps me face each day. But standing here now, I realize something. Every time we stay quiet, every time we accept being turned away, we're letting down the next veteran who walks through these doors." He paused, gathering his thoughts as Max leaned against him. "This isn't just about flying. It's about dignity. It's about recognizing that the battles don't always end when we come home. And sometimes, our strongest allies have 4 legs and fur." Tears flowed freely among the onlookers now. The Vietnam veteran who had spoken earlier made his way forward, snapping a sharp salute to Michael. Others followed suit, creating a spontaneous show of respect that transcended military protocol. But what happened next would transform this airport moment into a national movement. As Michael and Max finally turned to board their flight, Trump and General Wilson exchanged a look that would spark a chain of events no one could have predicted. Trump and General Wilson moved to a quieter corner of the terminal, their conversation intense but purposeful. Trump pulled out a small notebook, an old habit from his business days, and began jotting down points as the general spoke. "We need 3 things immediately," General Wilson said, his military precision evident in every word. "First, a clear legislative framework. Second, corporate partners willing to step up. And third, a way to identify and support veterans who've been quietly suffering through this same situation." Trump nodded, his pen moving rapidly across the page. "I can have my legal team draft something by tomorrow, but we need to make this bipartisan. This isn't about politics. It's about doing right by our veterans." A congressman who had been waiting for his flight at a nearby gate approached them. "Gentlemen," he said, extending his hand, "I couldn't help but overhear. I'd like to help. My son served 2 tours in Afghanistan. This hits close to home." The pieces were falling into place faster than anyone could have anticipated. As the 3 men talked, a news crew that had arrived to cover the initial incident began setting up for a live broadcast. The story was already spreading across social media, with hashtags like #ServiceDogAct and #VeteransFirst trending nationally. Back at the gate, Michael and Max waited for their turn to board. A young mother approached them, her small son clutching her hand. "My husband's deployed right now," she said softly. "He's been worried about coming home, about adjusting. Seeing you and Max today, it gives me hope." Michael knelt down to the boy's level, Max following his lead. "Your dad's a hero," he told the child. "And when he comes home, we'll make sure he has all the support he needs." The boy reached out tentatively to pat Max, who responded with gentle patience that spoke of his extensive training. Meanwhile, Trump had moved to address the growing media presence. His voice carried the authority of someone who knew how to command attention, but there was something different in his tone now, a personal investment that went beyond political calculation. "What we're announcing today isn't just another piece of legislation," he declared, General Wilson standing stoically beside him. "This is America finally stepping up to honor a promise. When our men and women in uniform come home, they deserve more than just words of gratitude. They deserve action." The general stepped forward, adding his own gravitas to the moment. Every day, approximately 22 veterans lose their battle with PTSD. Service dogs like Max aren't just companions, they're lifesavers. This act will ensure that no veteran has to choose between their service animal and basic activities like travel. The airline CEO, having arrived at the terminal after hearing about the incident, stepped up to the microphones. "Effective immediately, our airline is establishing a Veterans and Service Animals Support Office. We're allocating $10 million to help veterans with travel needs and service dog training programs." Other airline representatives in the terminal were already on their phones, calling their corporate offices. No one wanted to be left behind in what was quickly becoming a watershed moment for veterans' rights. A young software developer in the crowd raised his hand. "I'd like to help too," he called out. "I can build an app that helps veterans locate service dog-friendly businesses and travel options, free of charge." The momentum was building, but Trump wasn't finished. He turned back to Michael, who still stood by the gate with Max. "Son, we need you to be part of this. Your story, your voice, it matters. Will you help us make sure this never happens to another veteran?" Michael straightened, years of military bearing visible in his posture. "Yes, sir. Max and I are ready to serve again, in our own way." The boarding call for their flight finally came, but now it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. As Michael and Max made their way down the jet bridge, the entire terminal erupted in applause. Flight attendants stood at attention, forming an impromptu honor guard. Trump watched them board, then turned to General Wilson. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice carrying both determination and promise. "By this time next week, every airline, every public space in America will know. Our veterans and their service animals are not just protected by law, they're protected by the will of the American people." As the plane pushed back from the gate, carrying Michael and Max toward home, no one could have predicted how this single moment would ripple across the nation. In the days that followed, the Service Dog Protection Act would become more than just legislation. It would become a movement, a reminder that sometimes the greatest changes start with one person standing up for what's right. And as Trump and General Wilson left the terminal that day, they knew they had witnessed more than just a victory for one veteran and his dog. They had seen America at its best, people coming together, standing up for those who had stood for them, and proving that real change is still possible when we remember what truly matters. Days after the incident at DFW Airport, the story had taken on a life of its own. News channels ran continuous coverage of what they called the terminal transformation. But it wasn't just about Michael and Max anymore. A movement had begun, touching lives across the nation in ways no one could have predicted. In Washington, Trump stood before a packed press conference flanked by General Wilson and a bipartisan group of legislators. Behind them, a row of veterans stood with their service dogs, living testimony to the importance of what was unfolding. The Service Dog Protection Act, Trump announced, his voice carrying the weight of purpose, will be the most comprehensive legislation ever created for veterans and their service animals. But this isn't just about laws, it's about changing how America treats its heroes. The CEO of the airline, where it all began, stepped forward with an unexpected announcement. "We're not just changing our policies," he declared. "We're establishing the first-ever Veteran Service Dog Training Academy. Every year, we'll sponsor the training of 50 service dogs for veterans in need." But it was what happened next that truly showed the depth of change taking place across the country. Michael appeared on a morning news show, Max faithfully by his side. The nervous man from the terminal had been replaced by someone who spoke with quiet conviction. "Since that day at the airport," he explained, "I've received thousands of messages from veterans sharing their own stories. We're not just fighting for service dogs anymore. were fighting for understanding. The young software developer who had offered to help had made good on his promise. His app, Service Companion, launched with features that helped veterans locate dog-friendly businesses, connect with training programs, and share their experiences. Within days, it had over 1 million downloads. Corporate America took notice. Major hotel chains announced new veteran-friendly policies. Restaurants posted "Service Dogs Welcome" signs in their windows. Transportation companies competed to offer the most comprehensive support for veterans and their service animals. But the most profound changes were happening on a personal level. In Seattle, a Marine veteran named Sarah finally gathered the courage to apply for a service dog after seeing Michael's story. If he could stand up that day in the terminal, she told her counselor, I can take this step forward. In Miami, a restaurant owner who had previously been hesitant about service animals watched the viral video of Trump's intervention. The next day, he transformed his establishment's policy, even setting up a special water station for service dogs. It's not about rules, he said, echoing Trump's words from the terminal. It's about doing what's right. Back in Dallas, the terminal where it all began had been transformed. A permanent installation now stood near Gate C-23, a bronze statue of a service dog standing alert beside combat boots. The plaque read simply, "Sometimes the bravest acts start with standing up for others." Trump, true to his nature, wasn't satisfied with just legislation. He established a foundation dedicated to connecting veterans with service dogs, personally funding the training of hundreds of animals. Money means nothing, he said at the foundation's launch, if we don't use it to lift up those who lifted us. Michael and Max became unofficial ambassadors for the cause. They traveled across the country, speaking at veterans events and schools, sharing their story and spreading understanding. The little girl's ribbon still adorned Max's collar, a reminder of how a simple act of kindness had helped spark a national movement. The Vietnam veteran from the terminal became a regular volunteer at the new training academy. Back in my day, he told new recruits, we didn't talk about the invisible wounds. Now, seeing these dogs work with veterans, it gives me hope for all of us. 1 month after the terminal incident, Trump hosted a special ceremony at the White House. Michael and Max stood beside him as he signed the Service Dog Protection Act into law. But it was Trump's impromptu speech that captured the true spirit of what had been achieved. You know, he said, setting down his pen, we often talk about making America great, but America is at its greatest when we remember to take care of those who took care of us. This isn't about politics or parties. It's about promises kept. As the president spoke, Max rested his head on Michael's leg, a gesture so natural yet so profound in its meaning. The once anxious veteran who could barely face a crowded terminal now stood tall, a living testament to the power of standing up for what's right. The movement that began in that terminal continues to grow, touching lives in ways both big and small. But perhaps the most powerful change is the one that can't be measured. The renewed understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of courage start with simply refusing to walk away when others need us to stand. 1 year after the day that changed everything, Michael Anderson stood at Gate C-23 again. Max, graying slightly but still alert as ever, sat faithfully by his side. The terminal looked different now, not just because of the bronze statue or the new service dog relief area, but because of what it represented. A young veteran approached them, her own service dog walking perfectly in step. I had to meet you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Your story. It gave me the courage to get help, to admit I needed a partner like this. She gestured to the German Shepherd beside her. Michael smiled, remembering his own journey. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight alone, he said softly, until we realize we don't have to. Trump's foundation had now helped pair over 1,000 veterans with service dogs. The app that started in that terminal had grown into a nationwide network, connecting veterans with resources and support. But more than numbers or statistics, it was the small moments that showed how much had changed. Airlines now train their staff specifically in working with veteran service dogs. The training program included watching the video from that day, not as an example of what went wrong, but as a reminder of why it mattered to get it right. The Vietnam veteran who had stood up that day now ran a weekly support group at the local VA, sharing stories of how service dogs had transformed lives. "We're finally talking about the invisible wounds," he would say, "and these four-legged angels are helping us heal." Michael pulled out his phone, showing the young veteran a photo from the White House ceremony. In it, Trump stood with his hand on Max's head, a genuine smile on his face. "He still calls sometimes," Michael said, "just to check in, to make sure we're keeping the promise." As they talked, a flight was boarding nearby. No one questioned the service dogs present. No one stared or whispered. It had become as natural as helping an elderly passenger or guiding a child to their seat, just another way of honoring those who served. Max's collar still carried the faded ribbon from that little girl. Michael had been offered new ones, but he kept it as a reminder. Sometimes the smallest gestures of understanding could spark the biggest changes. If this story moved you, remember, change doesn't always require grand gestures or political power. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up, one voice willing to speak out, one heart willing to say this isn't right when others look away. Because in the end, true patriotism isn't just about flying flags or singing anthems. It's about how we treat the heroes who carry invisible wounds, how we honor the promises we've made, and how we stand up for what's right, even when it would be easier to walk away. Look around you today. Someone nearby might be fighting a battle you can't see. Your voice, your courage, your willingness to stand up, it matters more than you know.